Hello and welcome to the Effective Literacy Podcast. I am Victoria.
And I'm Anna.
And we are excited to have you with us today. If you've been listening to our previous episodes, you know Anna and I are educators who share a passion for reading and all things literacy. We know that literacy opens doors to reading and language skills through meaningful engagement. So we recently noticed an escalation of research and opinions around what are the best practices when it comes to literacy instruction, and specifically the role of phonics in reading instruction. In an effort to better understand the newest research, we are interviewing experts from across the nation with extensive knowledge in literacy and multilingual education to have a discussion about how to support our students, and specifically our multilingual learners, in becoming literate individuals by the time they graduate our educational system.
And today we are so excited to have Miss Nicole Knight with us. Nicole Knight is the Executive Director of English Language Learner and Multilingual Achievement Office at the Oakland Unified School District. She is honored to have served Oakland students for the last 24 years as a teacher, teacher leader, instructional leader at the site and at district levels. A national board certified teacher in English as a second language, Nicole has expertise in language and literacy development of multilingual learners, professional development for teachers and leaders, and equity-centered systems of continuous improvement. And she is also the mother of 2 bicultural and bilingual children, both students in Oakland Public Schools. Welcome, Nicole. We're so happy to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So we're going to jump right in to the tough questions from the beginning. But with a resume and with experiences like yours, we know that you've had the opportunity to see effective literacy in play in lots of different contexts. So in your opinion, in your experiences, what does effective literacy instruction look like and sound like?
So I would approach that question first by starting with our students and understanding what effective literacy looks like as it manifests through our students. And so I would say that literacy instruction understands our students as engaged and empowered readers and writers who are, yes, effective decoders and good test takers, but not just that. They're also meaning makers, they're code breakers, they're critical consumers, and they're creators of their own narratives. So in terms of actual instruction, there are different levels and various components of effective literacy instruction. And I would say that first, effective literacy instruction includes practices that are asset-based, which means that instruction leverages or builds on what students already know and bring in terms of language, but also experience, culture, and their unique perspectives. Effective literacy instruction includes high challenge and high support so that we see instruction that pushes students beyond what they can do independently. I love the notion from English learner expert Aida Walke, who compares powerful instruction to an apprenticeship. Mm-hmm. So students are expected and supported to engage in the critical literacy practices of the experts, right, in the field, the mathematicians and the historians and the writers. And so specifically, that means that students are reading and writing complex texts, but again, with lots and lots of support. So they experience the fullness and richness of what it means to be readers and writers. A third component is that we are including very explicit instruction of the skills that students need. So that includes foundational skills, certainly, phonemic awareness and phonics instruction, but also pulling back the curtain for students around how language works in order to decode, to comprehend text, and to write for the range of purposes and in a range of genres. Next, there is a very clear attention to language demands and opportunities. I believe it was reading expert Timothy Shanahan who describes reading as essentially a language activity. I love that. And of course, you would say the same thing about writing, right? You can't really think about understanding, comprehending text without really getting into the meaning of the language. And similarly, you have to have a really strong demand of language and all of its purposes and varieties in order to write effectively. So we have to place language at the center of any literacy instruction. And it's true for all students. All students are academic language learners. All students are learning the language of schooling and of writing. But this is especially true for students who are multilingual learners and for students who are still in the process of acquiring English. And finally, I would echo what Lori Olson and Kathy Escamilla remind us of, that literacy should not be narrowed to just reading. We often equate literacy with reading, and in recent times, sometimes we equate literacy with foundational skills, the foundational skills of decoding and phonics, which are foundational, they are critical. But literacy also encompasses expressions of ideas in writing and speaking. So it's not just receptive, it's interpretive, it's productive, it's creative. And my own teenage children remind me that we should actually be talking about literacies, not just literacy, and expand our notion to include multimedia. The way that our young people communicate is the way that we engage in communication now and in the future. And that's a mix of genres, like it's all the meshing of speaking and video and text and images, right? And so really challenging ourselves to expand our own notion of what literacy means. So in terms of, to get directly to your question of what does it look like and sound like, it looks like students showing joy and excitement in their reading, sharing reading experiences with each other, using their own languages and the language that they may be learning, making connections between the content, the narrative, and the language of text and that of their own experiences. And it looks like engagement in all the domains of literacy, reading and writing and listening and speaking, but also perhaps viewing and recording visual and multimedia content, to my last point.
You know what? I know Anna wants to say something so bad, but I just have to jump in because I love that you said I learned from my own teenage children, right? The idea that we need to say literacies. And I think that this, as a secondary teacher, it hits a piece of my heart. But it also is this idea that we have to see our students in the classroom, right? And hear what they need. And be inclusive, right? Back to that assets base, be inclusive of all types of literacy. So thank you for bringing that to the surface.
Yeah, I think as a mother of teenagers as well, and I don't understand why, I'm asking my kid, why do you have to take a picture and the text? Like, why do you need a picture every single time? But it makes me feel like old grandma, because you're right. That's just part of how they communicate. Well, they have to have the picture that goes with what they're doing, and it all informs the story, which makes a lot of sense. So we definitely can learn from our kids for sure. You touched a little bit on language and multilingualism, but as an expert, and especially working in the same district for the last 24 years and really looking at how we can best serve our multilingual students, when you're thinking about effective literacy in the classroom, what role does multilingualism play? And are there some specific points that you think are really important for us to pay particular attention to when it comes to helping our multilingual students become fully literate individuals?
Yeah, love the question. And I would say that first we have to start with recognizing what a gift multilingualism for our students and for our community. It's really nonsensical to somehow deny a student and a community of students the opportunity to become literate in their home language and multiple languages when the foundation is already there. Mm-hmm. So in practical terms, even if our goalpost is English standards or English literacy proficiency or English literacy benchmarks, the research is resoundingly and unequivocally clear that building on what students already know is the key to building strong literacy. This idea can seem counterintuitive for folks who haven't had the opportunity to be steeped in the research or have their own lived experience where they have seen this be true themselves or with their own children. Why wouldn't you just focus on English to improve English? But it's absolutely true that the best way to build literacy skills in English is to invest in a student's home language literacy when that's possible. And so the ideal context for a student who's still acquiring English may be to enroll them in a bilingual or dual language program. But of course, that's not always possible. And that's not always what a family wants for their child. And so there are multiple ways that teachers and families can leverage students' multilingualism in the classroom.
When you were talking about multilingualism, and I like this idea that you keep bringing up the assets base, you keep bringing up the gifts that our students are bringing to our classroom. You talk about the things that we're learning from our students, right? And that authentic engagement. So I want to think about back to that authentic engagement and really seeing our students and that assets and all of those gifts. And if I'm a classroom teacher and, whether it's my first year or my 20th year, and we have a curriculum and I'm looking at that curriculum and I'm seeing, over here, there's this tiny little sidebar that's just like, for an English learner, do this or do that, right? And it's so small. It's always so small, right? What advice would you give that teacher, right? What advice would you give them to really make sure that they're getting to those assets base, that they're seeing that student's gifts, that they're really having that authentic engagement and more than just that little bit sidebar?
Yeah, so I would say that it's always, before getting into a reading experience, a writing experience, or any experience, a content-based experience, starting with what do students already know and constantly bringing back to what do they bring, what do they understand, what is their own background knowledge, what did we just learn yesterday, what is, and in terms of language, how is this similar or different than the language you speak at home? If it's if you're in a bilingual setting, then it's very easy to make those connections constantly, very explicitly. But if you're in a multilingual setting with all types of languages represented, you can still ask those questions. You can still show curiosity, particularly when you get to points in a lesson that are sticky, that have deep conceptual depth, or when there's new language. How are you breaking that down for students by starting with what they know and bring? And so there's, lots of different techniques you can use to do that. And, recently there's a lot of research around translanguaging, which can be applied in any classroom. And so simply put, that's just giving students the opportunity to bring their whole linguistic repertoire to their learning. And so even when you have multiple languages in your classrooms, are there opportunities where students are sitting with a same language partner? Can they have the opportunity to process what they just learned in their own language, right? So not just allowing and tolerating for it, but actually encouraging and supporting students to do so.
So with that note, I'm just thinking about like our monolingual teachers, right? And myself included in that. And kind of sometimes that fear that I, as the teacher, I don't know what's going to be happening in that conversation. I don't know how to support it. What advice might you give that teacher? Or what strategy might you say, hey, start with this?
I would say if there's one thing for that monolingual teacher to think about is to start with curiosity. Just to pose the question of students, what are all the ways that you say this in your own language? And again, giving students the opportunity to process with the same language partner. It's a little bit of a releasing control, which can be really hard for the teacher, because if you don't know what students are saying, you don't have total control, but that's okay. You're giving students the space to make sense of what their learning is. And by showing curiosity of families, of students, you're showing that there's not a hierarchy of language, that the language of instruction, which is, primarily English and academic English, isn't the only one that's important, that you as a teacher can be a learner too, right? Which is such an important thing. We're all learners, and all languages have value, and there's value in us and learning from each other. And you as a student have something to teach all of us, including myself as a teacher. So that kind of curiosity stance can go a long way.
Mm-hmm. I love this idea of the curiosity and stance. And I know that Anna and I talk a lot about inquiry. And, our basis for the podcast is really our inquiry around like, what does work, right? We think we know what works, but like, how do we figure that out? But I want to go back to this idea of the relinquishing control. And I think as educators, one of the things that we're so afraid of with relinquishing control is that the kids are going to misbehave. It's just going to be chaos. But I want to come back to this idea of the authentic engagement. When our students are really engaged and we're meeting them where they are and we're seeing all the gifts that they're bringing, they're far less likely to misbehave, right? That fear that we have is not necessarily founded in much. Have you experienced that?
Absolutely. And there may be some times where kids go off track And you know what? That's okay. It's worth it. Teaching and learning is messy. I do one little story that from my own experience. My children, as mentioned, are bilingual, and my daughter is about 2.5 years older than my son. And when they were little, and actually until recently, even though they're teenagers, sometimes I would be explaining something and my son wouldn't understand. And my daughter would say, "It's all right. Let me translate this for him." And she wouldn't actually translate into Spanish. She would translate into quote unquote kid language. Like, let's actually understand the truth of the matter that kids are going to learn more from each other, especially if they're engaged in like rich text and rich task, right? It's worth it to relinquish control, even if it means that things get messy along the way. And it takes time to build the type of learning culture that students might not be accustomed to. It might not have been their previous experience, but it's a worthwhile venture and journey to get to that place.
Well, yeah. And I mean, we know that students who feel connected to their teachers, valued and seen, are more likely to learn and achieve in that class. So if you're creating a space that values other languages, that values other experiences, then when you ask them to turn and have a conversation, they're more likely to be on task because they are invested in the relationship with you as well as with the other people in the classroom. So I think that this idea of being curious models this authentic, like Victoria said, inquiry into other people, their experiences, their lives, and then bringing that back into the classroom only adds value to what it is that we're trying to do. So let's take just a little shift here. Now we talked about what's happening in the classroom, but we know that what's happening in the classroom is just one piece to educating students and helping students to become, to reach their full capability. And so we know that creating partnerships with families is what's absolutely going to help us move more swiftly and quickly along that trajectory. So in your experience, how might schools and families partner to ensure students are successful with effective literacy? And do you have any advice, or have you seen maybe some best practices in your own district that you would give to support a family in developing that effective literacy at home?
Yeah, we certainly leaned into this quite a bit during distance learning as we had to. And it gave us the opportunity to actually try and enact what we often say, which is, how do we partner with families truly? Like, see our families as partners, regardless of their own literacy experiences, right? And so I think the first message that I would advise schools to give their families and to support their families in doing is to read in their home language. Families sometimes need to be assured that the time, if I don't know English, I don't understand what's going on, it's okay. In fact, the best thing that you could do is to have that experience in your home language, not only because of all of the research we know about biliteracy transfer and the value of home language literacy, but because of the joy and bonding experience that can happen through that reading time. So all the opportunities to read and encouraging families to read in their home language, talking to your child about what they're reading and they're learning, modeling a love for reading, modeling if it's not a reading household and maybe there's not strong literacy backgrounds or practices, instilling pride in home language, and understanding that oral language is a foundation for literacy. So it's how young children acquire and try out vocabulary in new ways, and experimenting with new ways of putting together words and ideas. And so even that oral storytelling tradition is really important. So the ways that schools can support is, one, just messaging those principles and values. And then two, there are lots of great examples of family engagement workshops where, modeling happens and students and families are together and having that experience in a supportive environment. we in Oakland are engaging in the POLE strategies, the personalized oral language learning, which comes out of Fresno County. And so that is geared towards pre-K and TK educators, teachers, and leaders, and really leans in heavily to what are all of the strategies that our caregivers, our families, but also other caregivers can provide. So really taking time to lean into that. There are great professional development and lots of resources out there that schools can find and leverage for this purpose.
I like this idea of partnership. It changes the imagery that we so often think about, and this idea that we are partners with the families, that we're all working like together and symbiotically. And I also like that you touched on the idea that as schools, as districts, we want to make sure that that partnership is really communicated well in our messaging, right? That everywhere that we see this idea that we welcome the families, we want to hear from them, that we have this partnership. So I want to know if you know of other policies or, movements that districts, school sites, or even our states could take that really are going to help to support that fully literate student and literacy instruction.
California is a great place to start. There are so many amazing research-based, asset-based, and I would say aspirational policies and frameworks. And so frameworks that have been put out there as guideposts for us to strive towards. We don't yet have all of the curriculum and assessments and, in-service and pre-service that helps us get to that place, but it's a great starting place to really understand our vision. And so some of those policies and guidance documents are the ELA-ELD framework is a beautiful vision of quality instruction, really hard to get to, but a really important document that lays out what quality instruction looks like for all students, including our multilingual learners. And the English Learner Roadmap, of course, does a really great job of laying out the key principles and strategies that are critical for multilingual learners to get, to the vision of the framework, but also more holistically. Similarly, California's Global 2030 initiative lays out, some really important goals and signals to our schools and our families that multilingualism is valued and is something that we should strive towards. So I would say that those are some of the educational policies that, are really exciting.
Yeah. And so for our friends that are listening that aren't from California, would you just touch a little bit more about what is the big goal of the 2030 initiative?
So the 2030 initiative, and I don't remember all the specific metrics, but it's basically that we want more and more of our students to earn the seal of biliteracy upon graduation from high school. So that means that if they're coming with a home language, that we are, not just tolerating the home language and not just quote unquote respecting it or honoring it, but we're actually working intentionally to sustain that home language. And for students who come from monolingual families, they have the opportunity to learn new languages. And we do that in a reciprocal, multicultural environment where students are able to learn from each other and with each other, right? And so the goal really is that we have students who are on a multilingual journey and earning that seal of biliteracy by the time they graduate high school.
Thank you for that extra clarification. I know as a high school teacher, the kids love to have all those medals, all that swag on graduation. And so this is one medal that's there really celebrating multilingualism, right? And all the languages that we speak. So we've touched on these amazing policies that we could have, but we also know that sometimes our schools, our districts, sometimes our state policies create obstacles for that effective literacy. So I want you to touch on a couple of those, but I want you to touch on it from the lens of if you're working with an educator who's in one of those systems, how can they make sure that they're still meeting the needs of their students and complying with what their school, their district, their state is telling them they have to do?
Yeah, this is a tough one. And one that I think many of us, struggle with on a daily basis. I would say the number one issue that I have found is the English only assessment in our accountability systems. And that's at state and local and even national levels. We have a very narrow view of what success means. And until we broaden our notion of success, we're going to continue to communicate, even with these beautiful aspirational policies like Global 2030, if that isn't paired with an accountability system that is measuring multilingualism, or that is understanding that the journey of literacy is not as linear for a multilingual student, especially a multilingual student in a bilingual instructional context, that journey is going to look a little different. We're going to continue to get caught up in the, I have to focus on English. So my students learn English. They're getting ready to go to middle school. I can't focus on their home language. I need to get ready for middle school. They're about to take this math assessment. We're teaching math and Spanish. Maybe I should switch to English. Like all of those things surface. And so I think for a teacher and leader, it's really important to ground yourself in the research, spend some time doing that reading, because it can feel like a leap of faith to lean into a student's home language and multilingual skills, and believe that this is actually all going to transfer and work out. And we have to take the long view, right? It doesn't mean that we're not looking at assessment very carefully. It doesn't mean that we are dismissing what the data may be telling us of students who need additional support. But it means that we're grounded in the research around what a multilingual journey actually looks like. And so in terms of, something very practical, it is to try and incorporate opportunities for students to show what they know in their home language when that is possible. And so that is a very practical application. So there's a more holistic understanding of what a student is bringing, but also what the student is learning and how they're able to demonstrate that learning.
And I think what you're saying is also that when we're assessing in one language, that's one data point. And that as a classroom teacher or as an administrator, as a leader, that we are also advocating for making sure that we are able to communicate what the student knows in multiple languages. And that, yes, the data that we got from giving that reading assessment demonstrates this, but that doesn't create a full picture of what that student can do. And as a classroom teacher, I need to at least be able to verbalize that, especially I'm thinking like during parent conferences, right? When we're having conversations with families and saying, this was your student's score on this reading assessment. And while it's valuable and important, however, the rest of the information that I have from the classroom also shows that the student's able to do this or knows this, and et cetera, so that we're not just focusing on that one piece of data, that doesn't give us the only piece of information that we need to be able to communicate what the student knows and is able to do.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I love the notion of looking at a holistic data profile of students. And, this is something we're on our own journey around in Oakland. We haven't quite figured it out. So if there's any district leaders who have figured out how to demonstrate side-by-side data, particularly for students, in bilingual contexts, where we're able to look at their data in the partner language and data in English side by side and take kind of a holistic view. That's what we're working towards. But there's other ways that at a classroom level, a teacher can certainly do that. And it's also leaning into not just the quantitative data point, the Lexile score that was generated from the reading assessment or the SBAC score, but really leaning into student work and building our muscles around first looking at what the student can do and what the student does know before identifying those gaps. Both are important for the instructional experience. But if we don't start or at least include that analysis of what students do bring, then we're not leveraging what they have in order to bridge into what they need to learn next.
Right. We need to know where our students are starting if we want to be able to figure out where they need to go, right? So the conversation has just given us so much to think about as literacy teachers and advocates for multilingual learners. But we want to make a little connection to you personally, Nicole. As Victoria and I have shared, we're passionate about literacy, and we really believe that teachers of reading are readers and teachers of writing are writers. So for you personally, what are you currently reading or writing, whether personally or professionally?
I love this question, and I could probably do a whole other podcast just around the books that we're all reading. So I try. It doesn't always happen, but I am coming off some vacation time. So I am currently reading 2 books. I try and do an audio book in nonfiction and a real physical paper, not Kindle.
Both are reading. Both are reading.
Yeah, physical book in fiction. I don't know. That's just the rhythm that I've gotten in. And so I'm currently reading 2 books. And the nonfiction book that I'm listening to is called The Body Keeps Score. And it's about the effect of trauma on our brain, on children's learning, on, adult experiences, et cetera. It's really informative. And I think an important book for all of us to experience at some point. And then my tangible, physical paper book, fiction, is a fun one because it's, summertime. It's Bluebird by Attica Locke. And it's a crime story set in East Texas. So it has all the elements of a thriller, page turner, appropriate for summertime, but it's also a window. There's, a dark side to it, a window into the modern version of the KKK and ways in which racism continues to shape all things. And so I'm less than halfway through. Please don't give anything away if anyone knows anything about this book. I need to discover it on my own.
Well, and we don't need to make any excuses for reading a fiction book at all. I mean, as teachers, I think we often feel like we should be reading professional books all the time, but we talk a lot about taking a break, and sometimes your brain just needs to enjoy a story. I read a lot of YA books because I think that there's some really good literature out there for our middle grade students, but at the same time, it's also just a nice break to connect with students with a student story and then be able to say, hey, I read this book over the summer. And they say, really, you read that book? And you're like, yeah, it's awesome. So we can make those recommendations as well. So on that note, last question, and this is probably the toughest question of the whole podcast, is do you have an all-time favorite book?
So I'm going to give a cop-out answer, which is that's an impossible question.
I know.
And it's in part, I was thinking about this because it really depends on like the time of my life, like the phase of my life of what resonates with me. And so I will, what resonated with me as a teen, as a young person is so different than, currently. But I will say, I won't say a favorite all-time book. I will say my favorite current author is Louise Erdrich, who is, she is half Ojibwe and half French, I believe, or French descendancy. And her books are just beautiful. They're all beautiful in their own right, but she has some series, and as series, they're truly masterpieces. And so she has a long series called Love Medicine, and then another series called The Trilogy of Justice. And they both involve this as series. They involve this same very large cast of characters, intergenerational stories in different times and places and perspectives around similar events. And just, yeah, I recommend to anyone her books. Absolutely beautiful. And she actually owns a bookstore. And so she's dedicated her life to the love of books. And she's just a masterful storyteller.
Awesome. So the reason we ask those questions is that we can get recommendations. So thanks.
Recommendations and dreams for our retirement, owning a bookstore.
Yeah.
Well, Nicole, we really want to thank you for spending this time with us. We've learned a lot from you. You've given us some things to really think about. And you know, for our listeners, that it's so important that we just have these conversations as educators. Like, what can we do and what is working for us and our students? Thank you for uplifting the assets-based approach and really making sure that we're seeing our students, that we're listening to them, and that they're teachers in our classrooms and we're also students in our own classrooms. We really want to thank you for listening to us today. We are the Effective Literacy Podcast. For information and to get access to the resource mentioned today, please visit our show notes at multilingualliteracy.org and make sure to subscribe to our podcast. Have a great day.
Thank you.